Hello, Dreagen here, and on this episode of Writing Tips, we're going to be talking about world building. Now, if some of you are wondering what that means, there is a subtle answer and there's an obvious answer. We'll start with the obvious one, and that obviously means creating a world from the ground up. That means from scratch. So, if you're looking at something like Lord of the Rings, what J.R. Tolkien basically did was he literally created the world from its very origin. He had gave its own creation myth. He described how all the different races and beings came into being. He even created languages for all of them, the evolution of the languages, basically made it feel like this was a real place, like this is something that actually existed once upon a time. Now, if you're creating something for fantasy or science fiction, you don't have to quite go that extreme. If you want to, by all means. But a lot of times, what I find that people have done and what I have done is that I take a basic aesthetic, a look, a feel, a general vibe that I'm trying to go for, that I want to achieve. And then from there, I just say, okay, well, how did we get there? How did it come to look the way that it did? And one of the best ways to figure that out is to study the real world, study reality, look at the way things are today, and trace them back. Figure out and study how they came to be the way they are, because that's the thing about reality. Nothing just comes into because someone dreamt it up. Everything is the way it is because it is derivative of something else. It grew from something else. It evolved from something else. It was derived from something that came before, which changed over a time because of certain events that happened, that took place, when they did, how they did, with who they did, to arrive to where we are today. So, in essence, if your world, no matter how fantastical it is, no matter how unbelievable it may seem, if you want your reader to essentially, or viewer, suspend their sense of disbelief, to believe that something so fantastical can be real, you can go a long way to achieving that by designing the mechanics of how that world came to be the way that it is, by mirroring how it works in our world. Because if people see the progression of things behaving the same way there as they do here, they're a lot more likely to believe that it is possible within the framework of your narrative, even if, again, it did look something very different. So you can believe that there's a world of hobbits and dwarves, or that there's a galaxy far, far away with all sorts of different kinds of creatures, if you can kind of trace a progression of things. Now, that doesn't mean, again, you have to create every facet of that history like Tolkien did. Again, if you want to, you can, but just kind of understand the undertaking you're undergoing essentially by doing that. But like I said, as long as the mechanics of history function the same way they do as in the real world, the audience is going to be able to kind of grasp onto that. So even if they can't relate to the visual, if they can relate to at least a little bit how the visual came to be, because it's the same way of how the look of their world came to be, the mechanics of it, again, history, war, religion, these are all things that people can relate to, even if those elements are different from the way they happened in our world. Again, a different war, a different religion, different languages, a different ideology, whatever. It's not so much the specifics, but the generalization of what it is. So if you're creating something from scratch, essentially tell yourself that this is real, because essentially you're going to be asking your audience to believe that. And then design it as if you were writing a history paper. If you're working on an outline, do your research the way you'd be researching, ancient Greece or Rome or ancient Egypt. Think of it as a real place that obviously had an evolution of sorts that got it to where it ended up being. Now, with world building, yes, you can create a world from scratch, and yes, that is generally when that term is used. But the reality is, world building is really anything. Unless you're doing basically a documentary or like an autobiography where you're chronicling an actual event with actual people, the way it actually happened. And even then, there's usually certain creative licenses. But short of that, you're creating a variation of the world. So even if you're creating a historical piece where you're taking a real event at a real time in a real place, but you're inserting a different character into that time period, into that world, or you are now incorporating an element that did not exist into an actual event, an actual world, and in doing so are creating a world, because you're creating now a variation of our world. Even if you take something like, look, for instance, Men in Black is an example I like to use a lot, whereas in Men in Black, it's an idea of aliens living amongst us in our world, but our world is our world. It looks like our world. Everything is us, but basically everything is kind of a guise for something else. So while there's something that is fictitious happening beneath the surface is our world. But even then, you're still world building because you're creating kind of a sub reality for it. In our world, we don't actually have aliens living in plain sight, or do we? I guess they wouldn't be doing a good job if we knew that to be true. But the idea is you're still creating something that isn't real out of something that is real, and therefore it is no longer our world. The X-Files is another great example of that, where you're using real government agencies as fronts for something else, for cover-ups, for aliens and monsters and what have you. Again, you're using aesthetics from the real world, but you're using them to essentially tell stories or to explain certain narrative functions that otherwise are fictitious, that aren't real. And in doing so, you're world building. You're creating a version of the FBI. You're creating a version of our world to tell something that isn't real, to tell something that is fictitious. So world building, in short, can be building a world from scratch, starting from the ground up, a whole new world, a whole new race of people, languages, belief systems, history, or it can be simply just altering the existing world, our world, and tweaking it in a way that adds something fictitious to it. But in doing so, now creates a version of that world that is no longer really ours anymore, but has all the basic visual aesthetics of our world. Depending on which one you're going to use, your kind of approach, again, if it can be different. If you're, again, creating a world from the ground up, understand that you're going to really have to create a history for it. You're going to have to create an entire background, and that's why usually when you look at like fantasy novels, for instance, that where take place in a completely different fantasy world, they tend to be longer and thicker because you have to kind of create a precedence for everything. You can't just say such and such did something back then. Well, what is that thing? What is that event? How did that event come to be? How did that happen? Whereas if you're living like in the future and you're zipping around the galaxy in some kind of transport system, what is that transport system? How does it work? Who developed it? Is it a warp drive? Is it a portal through space? How are they doing that? Whereas if you're telling a science fiction story that takes place in New York City, and you need a character to get from point A to point B, you can just tell them, well, he hopped in a cab. Well, we all know what cabs are. We all know what New York City is. So it's easier in that sense, but at the same time, when you're doing kind of real world building, you have to take into fact that we know that a lot of these things aren't real, or so we've been led to believe. So you're going to have now the added task of making it believable that something that we know isn't in the real world when we look at it is actually there. And that's something you don't have to worry about when you're creating a completely made up world, because it's all made up. So the readers are going to be more inclined, or the viewer are going to be more inclined to believe it, because well, why not? Because obviously this isn't our world. This is completely removed from our world. So sure, why not? They could be riding on dragons. Sure. It doesn't need to really feel believable in that sense because you're creating a whole new place. But with that said, for someone to buy into the idea of that somewhere out there, someplace, we could be doing that, you need to create kind of a tactile feel for that world too. And that's another thing too when you world building, especially when you're going really fantastical. Try to incorporate as many kind of, it's just going to seem weird because again, especially if I'm talking about other worlds, but down to earth touches as you can. When I do like kind of like fantasy or really kind of high fantastical science fiction, I tend to try to design characters in a way that feel more grounded in reality, because the way I look at it, they're probably not speaking English anyway, so you can kind of phrase them in ways that feel more modern, more contemporary, and what that does is kind of adheres them more to the audience now, because it feels like, okay, that they're more real people. Like, even though they may look different, they may be wearing vastly different kinds of clothes, they might be driving vehicles that look completely different. If their approach to life is similar to our own, it makes it so your audience is kind of relate to them a bit more. And when you relate to the characters, you kind of buy into the world more, no matter how fantastical it is. Because if you believe them, then you can believe what it is they believe to be real, what they deem as normal. Because from the outside looking in, something like Lord of the Rings is not normal. Something like Star Wars is not normal. Even something like Star Trek, which is, clearly our future, can feel not normal. Even though there's a lot of visual aesthetics that feel like it grows from our world, it's still taken to a much further degree that can create a level of disconnect. So by having these characters behave and react and interact with each other in a way that feels familiar, it allows you, the audience, to kind of like, okay, yeah, it's not our world, but I can buy it. So with world building, just remember, if you're starting from the ground up, create a history for it. Even if you're not going to dive really deep into history, just kind of have it layered in the background so it feels like it's not something that just sprung up out of nowhere. And the best way to do that is to study history. Look at history. Study events. Look at World War II. How did World War II happen? There were a chain of events that led to it. It didn't just happen one day. That's how reality works. Things don't just happen. They evolve. They grow. They come from something else. So apply that kind of thinking to your world, and you'll find that it'll start taking on a life of its own, because you'll understand that it is the way it is. Creating a world based out of our world, yes, you get it a little bit because you don't have to explain how planes work, but you also have to explain how something that we don't see in our world exists in our world, how it came to be, how it works, and how it might have to stay hidden, and why it stays hidden, and the forces at work that allow it to stay hidden. So, the random schmuck walking around the street doesn't know that the bank teller is actually an alien in disguise, or, that the Chrysler building is really an alien, device of some kind. You have to kind of make it believable that all this stuff can be happening in plain sight without us knowing about it. So with that said, that's world building in a nutshell. Yes, there's always more to it than that, but if you kind of approach kind of both ends of world building from that, you'll find that it'll come together a lot more. Again, remember, you are both the god and the slave of the world you create, meaning you're kind of free to create what you want to create, especially if you're creating a world from scratch. But once you create those rules, once you kind of create those aesthetics, and once you kind of devised what works, how it works, and why it works, you yourself are now bound to it. You can't just devise something one way and then in a sequel completely change it just because you don't want to do it that way, or you thought of a different way that just you think is better, because then it's a plot hole. Then people are going to be like, well, how can this happen when you clearly established before that it couldn't happen? And again, sometimes there's ways, narratively speaking, to get out of that. But I would advise not trying to always, reverse engineer your story. Create a world and stick with it, and that's kind of the fun of it too, because once you kind of adhere to these rules that you've created, you yourself kind of discover the world for what it is. Because if your world has rules like our world, it kind of shapes it. It kind of determines the look, the feel, and the course it's going to take. And as a writer, that's kind of the fun part, because you yourself have to think of yourself as a spectator. Yes, you created this world, but if your world really is to feel real, it needs to feel real to you. And the way you can go about doing that is to feel that you are bound to the rules just like anybody else. You may want something to happen, but it can't happen because the rules of that world dictate that it can't. And by adhering to those rules and those restrictions, you'll feel like you're kind of exploring this world like your viewer, like your reader. So your world building, stick to the rules, develop good rules, develop rules that you're going to enjoy working within. But once you've got them, once you've set them down, once you've written them down, once you've recorded them, once you've shot them, stick to them. If you're building a world from scratch, study history, understand the mechanics that are involved with the progression of time, with the passage of events, and apply that to your fictitious world, because that'll make it that much more real to the people when they read it or watch it. Because again, things work the same way they work in our world, even if the end result is something very different. And if you're creating a world out of ours, just enjoy the fact that you don't have to explain every nitty-gritty detail, but also understand that you're going to have to work extra hard to make people believe that something that isn't real is real within the real world. So with that's going to do it for this episode of Writing Tips. If you have any questions, comments, leave them down in the comment section below. I'll be happy to answer them. And again, I'm not pretending that I'm an all-knowing expert, but this is advice that has been given to me by people who I feel are much more talented than I am. And it has helped me tremendously in developing my work, and now I hopefully can pass this on to you, and maybe you can apply it, and it may help you kind of get around certain issues you might have been having with your work. And if it's me just telling you what you already know, congratulations, you're that much further ahead. So thanks for watching, guys. If you haven't already, subscribe, and catch you on the next episode. Peace.